Right, we're all set for a second go. Is Christianity a blessing or a curse to society? This topic's a little bit more straightforward. But it's one which atheists, there's sort of four of them which have been going to go. They say that atheism is a terrible religion. And they quote from the Bible and that sort of thing, which is another session on the Bible. But I want to look at the question when they say that terrible things have been done in the name of religion. And it's true. Of course, all religions get lumped together, which is a problem. Certainly when we get the events like 9/11, it's highlighted some of the negative aspects of religion. And religion has been regarded as being responsible for a lot of violence and bloodshed, which is true. However, sometimes the politics gets mixed in with the religion. And I think this is perhaps the case in Northern Ireland, where the political divisions were added to by the religious ones. And critics of the Christian church often say, look at the Crusades, look at the Inquisition and the Salem witch trials that were carried out, supposedly in the name of Jesus. Well, the Crusades were a response to Muslim aggression, and the violence was directed against Jews as well as the Christians. And of course, there were always politics involved. In the witch trials, there was belief that people could have an astral appearance; they could appear in two places at once. So it's very hard to prove something when people think you can be in two places at once. And so you'll find that there's all sorts of problems if you go back historically, and you'll find that in fact some of these events have been misquoted. There's one book by D'Souza on the list there. He's a journalist who's looked very carefully at some of these events and shown how, in fact, in many ways they've been misconstrued. Numbers have been blown up and all sort of thing. And Jesus had some pretty harsh words to say to people who did things in his name that weren't in God's will. So the non-Christian slant on these events, in some cases, is not actually true, but exaggerated. But the events did happen, and it's a blot on the church, and it's a blot on Christianity. But of course, as we know, Jesus was not like that. You know, he told us to pray for our enemies, and bless those that curse us, and this sort of thing. So there are some negative things which the church has to face sometimes, but they are blown up out of all proportion, and often other factors are not taken into account. So what are the things which show that Christianity is actually a blessing? Well, I think it began with the spread of Christianity. I mean, Christianity spread very rapidly in spite of intense persecution. And why? Because, and you will see this recorded in some of the historians at the time, Christians were kind to each other. They cared about the poor and the needy. Their love for one another, their sharing of possessions, and of course their spiritual empowerment by the Spirit of God. People won over. And I know the Catholic Church has come in for a lot of criticism over sexual abuse, but people are unaware of the many selfless and sacrificial works carried out by nuns and priests in helping the poor and needy throughout the world. You know, the wrong stuff gets the publicity, and they forget that all the good that's been done by these people. And they've gone to parts of the world that other people won't go to, like living on a rubbish dump or going to those in the leper colony. And we find that Christians have also established a wide range of aid organisations like the Red Cross, hospitals, homeless shelters, orphanages, rehabilitation groups, and many others. And of course, atheists who argue that many of the current conflicts are religious wars are not in fact supported by the media. The conflicts have more to do with ethnic rivalry, politics, or autonomy and self-determination. So again, things get twisted. What atheists don't fully acknowledge are the mass murders carried out by atheistic regimes, such as communism, Nazism, and Maoism. And they try to come up with alternative explanations which don't stand up. D'Souza, he concludes, atheism, not religion, is responsible for the worst mass murders of history. Some have tried to compare secular tolerance is much better than religious intolerance. This is not a true comparison, because we find that severe secular intolerance has been carried out in the 20th century in some very severe ways. For example, in Soviet Russia, Communist China, and Cambodia by the Khmer Rouge, they tried to control religion and led to more oppression And a guy called McGrath, who's another apologist, in his history of atheism, he says, the 20th century gave rise to one of the greatest and most distressing paradoxes of human history, that the greatest intolerance and violence of that century were practiced by those who believed that religion caused intolerance and violence. So there you have it. And then another guy called Spencer, in 2014, this year, he refers to various kinds of atheists. And in his introduction he says, attempts to build atheistic societies in Russia, China, Albania, North Korea and elsewhere ended with humiliating, enslaving and killing on a scale that made previous religious wars look like playground scuffles. And so the atheists should not point their finger. Then we have the missionaries. Of course, missionaries have sometimes had bad press at times. They have in the past been accused of being insensitive to local cultures and their traditional spiritual practices. And though it's true at times then, it's not certainly the case now. And sometimes missionaries do get linked up with sort of peculiar interests of colonial powers that leads to exploitation. And the missionaries get blamed for it. It has nothing to do with them, they're just linked with it. And get blamed for some of the inappropriate things that happened. The big thing is that missionaries did and are still doing an enormous amount of good for people who are struggling in terms of such things as education, health, and the promotion of local industries like we have at our church. Often Christian organisations are first on the scene when there's a tsunami. I actually support two of them, and I've been doing so for many years. One is Gospel for Asia, which supports indigenous people to go out and speak to their own people, and Every Home for Christ. And both these organisations are out there helping people at ground level, not just spreading the gospel, but doing other things as well. And in New Zealand, you know, the Maoris bought guns off the traders and could have killed each other off, but they learned peace from the missionaries. And Woodbury, 2012, makes a strong case that Protestant missionaries heavily influenced the rise and spread of stable democracy around the world. And he argues and provides statistical evidence that they were a crucial catalyst initiating the development and spread of religious liberty, mass education, mass printing, newspapers, voluntary organisations and colonial reforms, thereby creating the conditions that made stable democracy more likely. Another thing about religion is that there are health benefits of religion. In the past, some people, like Freud and Dawkins, for example, have claimed that Christianity is not good for a person's psychological well-being. And although there will be some Christians who have unhealthy attitudes, research suggests that committed Christians tend to be healthier, live longer, suffer fewer psychological problems like depression, and are more community-minded than non-believers or nominal believers. Also, as a general rule, they are caring members of society, will give a lot more time and money to help the needy than their neighbours. Study after study has shown there is a relationship between the strength of one's spirituality and one's overall strength. And the same is true with recovery from illnesses. There's a comprehensive survey of over 1,200 studies and over 40 reviews of studies in health and religion in 2012 to support this. The evidence is there. Science also flourished under a Christian umbrella. For the first 14 centuries, there was generally harmony between science and theology. This was basically achieved because the church had a monopoly on education, not only in classic but also in mathematics and astronomy. And Aristotle produced a comprehensive scientific theory of the world, and Thomas Aquinas, the famous theologian and philosopher, had reconciled this with dogmatic theology. So as far as the church was concerned, the ultimate had been reached in the understanding of the world. And any questions of fact were not settled by experiment, but by authority, the authority being the church. It's been argued that by some skeptics that Christianity held up scientific progress. This is not true. Even at the time of Galileo, when the telescope he invented in 1609 showed Aristotle's theories of the solar system to be false, the majority of scientists and philosophers in Egypt still stood solidly with the church. They believed that science had to ultimately be compatible with the Christian view of the world. Also, if God created the world, then studying the world was a means of learning about God. Galileo, who was a devout Catholic, and had support from the church for a number of years. Unfortunately, he raised not only questions with his telescope, but he also dogmatically went against the available evidence. So it's not surprising he did get into a bit of trouble, but he still was a devout Catholic. And so we find that science, in fact, owes a considerable debt to Christian scientists in the 17th century. They believed that nature is not an aspect of God, but rather God's intelligible creation could be explored and we could find out about it. And because God was rational, they believed the world was a rational and ordered place, an appropriate focus of scientific inquiry. Now in England there was no conflict between science and Christianity. There was no persecution of the new experimenters. The Royal Society was founded in 1662 to the glory of God. And some of those initial scientists were not only great scientists, but they were devoted students of the Bible. For example, Robert Boyle, who may have some of you done chemistry, I did chemistry 1, which is not much. He's the father of modern chemistry, and we've got John Ray, who's laid the foundation of botany and zoology, and Isaac Newton, who is Principia Mathematica. He invented calculus. All of those had a fundamental faith. They also were students of the Bible. And so everything in the universe, including the heavens, moved according to fixed laws that showed the handiwork of God. And before 1860, most scientists were Christians, and included all sorts of famous names like Faraday, Babbage, Simpson, Mendel, Pasteur, Kelvin, Lister, James Clerk Maxwell with the Maxwell equations and so on. Now there was a conflict at the early stage in history, but not between science and Christianity. It was between experimental science and the ideas of Aristotle and the Greek pseudoscience, where they just used logic. In other words, if you want to know how many teeth a horse had, you sat down and you thought about it and you worked it out in your head. The scientists today would go and have a look and get it straight from the horse's mouth. And that's the difference between experimental science and theoretical science. And what is interesting is that, and Glenn D'Souza mentions this, that historians are virtually unanimous in holding that the whole science versus religion story is a 19th century fabrication. And he mentions two well-known books, one by John William Draper in 1874, and another one by Andrew Dixon White, and he describes them as full of whoppers and lies. So anyway, there are also some myths about Galileo, but I won't go on to those, so I want to have a bit more time at the end. However, some seeds of conflict were sown, and one of the reasons is that both sides were dogmatic. The theologians on the one hand clung to views that were difficult to defend, and they were slow to recognise the right of science to offer its own explanations. The scientists, on the other hand, were slow to realise they're not concerned with the ultimate problems. And there are certain questions outside the realm of scientific investigation. What I find interesting is that many of the American earliest colleges and universities began as Christian institutions. For example, Harvard and Yale, both founded by church people, one of them by a minister. About 90% of American colleges, I don't know about other countries, that's just the one I'm to find, about 90% of American colleges were church founded late at the time of the Civil War in the 1860s. Also we find that under the auspices of the church were the first medical research institutions and the first observatories were established and supported. From the Middle Ages to the Enlightenment, a period of several centuries, the church did more for Western science than for any other institution. Finally, final topic is Christianity and society. What has Christianity done for society? And if we look at the ancient societies of Greece and Rome, we see that Christianity spearheaded a number of very revolutionary ideas. You know, there's a form of a Jewish morning prayer where there was a sentence in which a Jewish man gave thanks that God had not made him a Gentile, a slave, or a woman. And Paul turned this round, and in Galatians 3:23 he said there's no difference between Jew or Greek, male or female, bond or free, as all one in Christ. And so what happened is into the world came this revolutionary way of thinking. With regard to the Jews and the Gentiles, the Jews were a chosen people of God because of God's covenants through Abraham, Moses and David. And consequently the Gentiles, or the non-Jews, were looked down upon. The Talmud, that contains the written traditions of the Pharisees, excuse me, says some very negative things about the Gentiles. However, Paul, himself a Jew of high standing, explained that Jew and Gentile had access to God through Jesus Christ. And Jesus himself also at several times commented about the Samaritans and about the need to take the gospel to the Samaritans, or to take the word to the Samaritans. I won't go down that path. Jews and Gentiles, husband and wife. Now, as far as the Jewish law is concerned, the wife was not a person but a thing. She had no legal rights and was absolutely in her husband's possession. At the time when Paul wrote his letter, the husband could divorce his wife for just about anything. The Greek situation in regard to women was worse. Prostitution was a major part of Greek life. The Greek expected his wife to run his home, care for his legitimate children, but hound his pleasure and companionship elsewhere. To make matters worse, there was no legal procedure of divorce. It was a matter of whim. In the Roman world, the situation was even worse than with the Greeks. The mighty Romans had conquered the known world, and originally divorce was unheard of in the Roman Republic. Unfortunately, we know there was a rapid decline in morality in the Roman Empire and a decline in marital relationships. So at the time of Paul writing, family life was virtually wrecked and the marriage bond was on the way out. And so what happened was that Christianity came along and raised the status of women. What about parents and children? If Christianity did much for raising the status of women, it did even more for children. In any civilization, generally, children are loved. But in pre-Christian and heathen civilizations, there could exist cruelty which would be totally unacceptable in our country today, where Christian principles have formed the fabric of our society. And people sometimes forget that when they start talking about Christianity and how harmful it is, when our society and the way we think is very much based on our law. In contrast, we see in the Roman civilization certain features that made life perilous for children. The first was the father's power over the children. He had absolute right over the child until the child died. And the father could even sell his children as slaves or even inflict the death penalty on them. What made the life perilous for a child was the custom of child exposure. I forget what it is, patria potestas or something in Latin, which I've forgotten. I did actually do some Latin at school. It's how it's helped me, and I don't know, but it's probably, in fact, I was good at knuckle bones, and that's also helped me for the rest of my life. Anyway, what happened was a newborn child was placed at the father's feet. If he picked up the child was accepted, but if he walked away, the child was thrown out. Furthermore, if a child was sickly or deformed, it had little chance of being allowed to live. It was into this situation that Paul wrote his advice to Christian parents and children. He didn't advocate taking away the father's power, but he's asking for a transformation of the relationship. What Paul has done is, rather than say, women rise up and revolt, he's tried to transform from within rather than impose something from without, realising he's up against a society which is patriarchal and which has certain views. And so the same is true with other things I'm going to mention. So as far as children is concerned, he was trying to transform the relationship. And we see this particularly with masters and slaves, because at the time of writing there was a huge number of slaves in the Roman Empire, something like 60 million slaves. And a Roman citizen didn't work, as it was undignified. So the slaves did virtually all the work, and some of them were doctors, teachers, personal secretaries. But generally the life of a slave was pretty grim, as a slave in law was just a thing rather than a person. And the master had power of life and death over the slave. A slave was too old or sick to work, could be just thrown out like a broken tool. However, slaves did quite well financially and could eventually buy their way out of slavery. Now, Paul didn't tell the slaves to rise up and rebel, because it was a fundamental part of the way society works. What he did, though, was to try and change the relationship. Told them to be good and obedient slaves, even if the master is a believer. and serve their masters as they would serve Christ, even when the master's not around. Then Paul had a word for Christian masters. He points out, although a man may be mastering men, he is still a servant of God. And one day both master and man will stand on an equal footing before God, as God is no respecter of persons. Paul doesn't condone slavery, is what some people might say, because it existed many centuries before Christianity and was widely practiced through the ancient world, and it was an integral part of life. He couldn't really change it from the outside. He could only change it from within. And so Christians were the first group in history to start an anti-slavery movement. And it was through the influence of Christianity and Christian men like Wilberforce in Great Britain and John Woolman in America and many others who devoted their lives to the cause that slavery was eventually abolished. Other examples of Christian activism are such as the Civil Rights Movement in the United States in the mid-20th century, the abolition of apartheid in South Africa in the 1990s, and the bringing down of totalitarian regimes such as communism in Eastern Europe in the latter part of the 20th century, with the Berlin Wall coming down in 1990. And we thank people like Martin Luther King Jr., Desmond Tutu, and the Polish priest Jerzy Popieluszko for their leadership and role in bringing their changes. And so what we find is that there are a lot of social contributions that Christianity has made. I've got a list of about 15 here. I'm not going to read them all to you. Just mention a couple of them. They developed a new importance of family life. They introduced the consent on part of both man and woman for marriage. In some countries, marriages are still arranged, and people are often pressured into marriages against their wills. Extending respect to ordinary people, as reflected in new political institutions in the West. Introducing the notion of political and social accountability through a new model of servant leadership that Jesus introduced. Leaders are judged how well they respond to the concerns and the needs of people they lead. Very different concept of leadership. Some of the principles of economics. They led to capitalism. Well, capitalism has been abused, but as a principle, it's still not a bad one. Some people have said it's a selfish system, but it's not only capitalism, it's the human nature and the way it is used. The Bible doesn't condemn money, but the love of money. And so, there's several others, and I'm going to stop here. There are many great people who've dedicated their lives to the service of others, such as Mother Teresa and Albert Schweitzer. They have come out of Christianity. We don't find this in other religions or secular society. And the modern concept of freedom, whereby we have a right to express our opinions, choose where to work and live, is basically inherited from Christianity. And so Christianity introduced the idea of equality of all people, as every person is important to God, and God is no respecter of persons. Another concept, no less crazy, is the concept of equality of souls. This is by Nietzsche, who was a very negative philosopher. And he couldn't understand why that to him it was crazy. To him it was crazy. The Christian idea was the propelling force behind the campaign to end slavery, the move for democracy and popular self-government, and also the successful attempt to articulate an international doctrine for human rights. Well, I'm going to stop there. There's a bit more about that, but I won't go on. I won't bore you with more details. You've had quite a bit. We need to have a bit of time for discussion and to sort of wind up and make sure everybody's got something.